To acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors programs. They both contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organizations. And, you know, they make our organization a much more diverse and far-reaching group, so we thank them. I also want to say thank you to the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, as well as today's financial sponsors, John Menninger and Adam and Bridget Ingersoll. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Keith Porter is President and CEO of the Stanley Foundation. He was previously the Director of Policy and Outreach for the Foundation. Keith has played a leadership role at the Foundation's transition towards a dynamic advocacy organization focused on multilateral policy change goals. He was previously the co-producer and co-host for the Foundation's nationally syndicated public radio program on world affairs, Common Ground, from 1988 to 2004. Keith has been recognized through numerous awards of excellence in broadcast journalism, including by the National Press Club and the United Nations Correspondents Association, among others. Keith holds a graduate degree from Illinois State University. Jen Smyser is Vice President and Director for Policy Programming for the Stanley Foundation. Jen leads a team of policy professionals in advancing multilateral actions to create fair, just, and lasting solutions to critical issues such as nuclear security, genocide prevention, and climate change. Jen previously oversaw the Foundation's nuclear security policy programming. Jen has extensive experience dealing in international affairs, U.S. global engagements, and citizen diplomacy. Jen holds a BA in political science and international studies from Iowa State University and a master's in public administration from Drake University. See, we know how to cross the aisle and welcome Iowa State grads here. We appreciate the two sharing their time and expertise with us for today's programming. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Keith Porter and Jen Smyser.
Well, I'm going to go first, and then you'll hear much better stuff from Jen. How many of you wake up in the morning and turn on the news or open the newspaper or look at your phone with sort of one eye closed and a little fear in your heart, thinking, oh my gosh, what might have happened overnight? Yet it may have come from the White House or it may have come from somewhere else, because we live in a world of very difficult times. On the way over here, I was listening to an interview with Richard Haass, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and his new book is called A World in Disarray. And I think that tells you something when the president of the Council on Foreign Relations has a book called A World in Disarray. So we want to talk about some of that today and give some background and context to that world, how we got here, and what we think may happen going forward. I also want to note that the history of the international order that we all live with is quite parallel to the history of the Stanley Foundation, and in fact is intertwined with the history of the Stanley Foundation in many ways. And so Jen and I are both going to try to highlight those connections as well as we go forward. The Stanley Foundation, many of you may not know, is in Muscatine, Iowa. It's been there for quite some time, and I'll be giving you a little bit of background and history on the foundation as we go forward. So the international order, 70 years in the making, rising from the ashes of World War II. There were certainly attempts before World War II to create some order in the international system, but really the system that we live under right now has its roots in that post-World War II era. The current order was formed as a system of states, member states, as equal partners coming together, universal in nature, and with that sovereignty, that idea of sovereignty as being one of the major pillars of this system. Certainly the system we live under right now, whether you call it the international order, the liberal international order, global governance, the global system, whatever it is, it came about with Western leadership. It was the Allies, the victors of World War II, were the driving force behind this system to create global cooperation, to create systems of governance, not government, but systems of governance, the regulations that people can collaboratively come to try to add some order to a system. This system has as its underpinnings the rule of law, peaceful methods of conflict resolution, primarily diplomacy. The very fact that we have nations coming together in institutions like the United Nations on a regular basis, almost daily basis, seeing each other, talking about national interests, hopefully talking about issues and problems as they arise, long before they become even the potential for shooting conflict, allows for that peaceful method of conflict awareness and resolution. They also came together to promote free trade. I mean, we cannot dismiss that as a huge reason why nations came together and formed this international order. The belief that global prosperity would be good for everyone, that a rising tide would lift all ships, and that if we worked together, we could actually create an international trade system that worked for everyone, that provided goods to people who didn't have access to goods and provided jobs and markets for many others. There were lots of institutions that were created at the birth of this international order and have continued to be created over the last 70 years. At the top of that pyramid is the United Nations. The United Nations Charter has every recognized nation in the world as a member, so it has universal membership. But there are lots of other elements as well. We have the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, created very close to the same time. Also created at the same time was the International Court of Justice. This is a court that exists for nation states to take lawsuits against each other to a court. The International Court of Justice doesn't try individuals. It is a conflict, it is a court of arbitration for nation states, and it's another piece, it's another facet of that idea that we can resolve conflicts without shooting at each other. Many times the International Court of Justice serves as a face-saving measure for two nations that are locked in a dispute to jointly agree to put it off into that court where they know it will take years to resolve, allowing them to move on to other business. The World Trade Organization is a part of this international order. In 1999, we had the International Criminal Court added to the system, a court that can try individuals for very serious crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. So these elements continue to be created. There are treaty-based institutions that are part of this system as well. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Organization for the Prevention of the Use of Chemical Weapons. All of these are treaty-based institutions created by member states, and together they form this very odd tapestry that we call the international order. It provides a lot of global benefits, but sometimes they're hard to recognize. And I think many people in the world have forgotten or are forgetting what the benefits of this international order have been. So I think it's worthwhile to review some of those. First and foremost is that we have not had World War III. I mean, this was one of the original aims of the founders of the United Nations, to say that we had come out of this horrible world war, that we had fought a world war in 1917-18. We had a second world war from 39 to 45. And now we've gone 70 years without having global powers, without having the great powers in direct conflict with each other. That's a major win. That's very important, and it's something that's easy to forget. We've also avoided the use of new nuclear weapons. Since the atomic bombs were used at the end of World War II, there has not been a nuclear weapon used in anger. And we've also limited the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. Sometimes it's hard to remember when we hear about other nations experimenting with nuclear weapons. But when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was being debated, experts warned that it would only be a short amount of time before 30, 40, even 50 countries would have the technological capability to create nuclear weapons, and many of them would choose to do so. Today we have about 12. That's, again, a major benefit of this international order. This is something that we should be very happy about, we should be proud of, and we should want to preserve. We've also limited the number of nuclear weapons. Now, again, I'm not naive, and I know that one nuclear weapon is too many. But when I was born, there were about 30,000 nuclear warheads in the world. By the time I was in high school, we had reached our peak of about 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. And today we're on about 15,000 nuclear warheads in the world. That's 15,000 too many, but I also feel like it's better than 70,000. This international order also gave us a way to deal with transnational problems. So many of the big problems facing the world today are problems that no one country can fix. So maybe it's the spread of disease, environmental concerns, the trafficking of drugs and people and other things, ruling the global commons, whether it's the atmosphere or the oceans or the poles. Before the existence of the international order, there was no common table for every nation in the world to come together to talk about transnational problems. So the very existence of the table is the first step towards solving the problem. And so one of the benefits of the international order is that we have that platform. We have that place where countries can come together to try to address those problems. It's also worth noting that this international order, or at least during the time of this international order, efforts on disease, hunger, and development have saved or enhanced billions of lives. Again, I'm not naive. I understand that there is horrible, horrible poverty in the world. There are debilitating diseases that have cures that aren't being treated by people around the world. But without the system we have in place now, I truly believe that many, many more people would be in poverty and many more people would be suffering from disease. And the system itself has the capacity, if it's fully resourced, to address many of those issues. And so, again, I feel like that's a benefit, that that's a system that we should want to enhance. Finally, I just want to remind people that we have global systems of trade, transportation, and communication that could not possibly exist without global cooperation. When we think about communication, as basic as the fact that I can step out here in the street and mail a letter to a friend in France or a friend in Australia with pretty good confidence that that letter will be delivered is a modern miracle. The fact that it could cross all those borders and get to its appointed designation for a relatively low price, that's pretty amazing. But then you fast forward to the electronic age, where we have satellites that facilitate global communication. Around the Earth, there are the geosynchronous, geostationary orbits where those satellites have to sit. There are very limited slots in that orbit that actually work to create that global communication system. So someone has to decide who gets to put their satellite there and who gets the next slot and the next slot. Also, all those satellites have to operate on different frequencies. Otherwise, they would interfere with each other. Someone has to make a decision. So there are agencies, institutions, part of the United Nations family that make those decisions. And countries abide by those decisions because they know that that kind of cooperation is good for everyone. It helps everyone actually make the system work. That's a benefit. That is a benefit of this international order. Trade, the same way. We have cargo ships carrying these big containers that go from port to port. They go around the world. Goods get delivered from factories to people who want those goods, and other things get shipped back. That's a system that could not exist without without that level of global cooperation. When we think about transportation of people, when a Air France 747 wants to land in Tokyo and the pilot calls the control tower, what language is that pilot using? English, right? Now, that's great for us, right? But someone had to make that decision. Someone had to say, in international air travel, what's the language we're going to use? What are the standard markings going to be on the runways? What are the system we're going to use to give all the telemetry data to the pilots? Who's going to be the air traffic control? Someone had to make these decisions. Without an international body providing that level of governance, it would be chaos. And so one benefit of this international order is that we've been able to come together to create these things. So before we go further in this conversation about the international order, I think it really is beneficial. Before we start talking about the problems, because there are plenty of problems, I think it's really good to at least acknowledge the benefits, the things that we've all received from this system, and why it might be worth saving. One of the people who saw the great potential of this newborn international order was Max Stanley. Now, when I address a group, particularly in Iowa, and I know I have at least one person in the room who can answer my question positively, who here actually knew Max Stanley or Betty Stanley? Raise your hand. A couple of people over here. Thank you. I do want to point out that I have one board member and one family associate over here. Beth Shriver, would you stand? And Tim, would you let everyone know you're here? Beth is Max and Betty Stanley's granddaughter. So thanks, Beth, for being here. And Beth is on the board of the Stanley Foundation. So that generation, Max and Betty's generation, looked at that end of World War II, the fact that atomic weapons were used, and said, if we ever have a third world war, it will be fought with nuclear weapons. And the best chance we have for preventing that is to promote the United Nations and other forms of global cooperation. That was the message from Max Stanley. In 1956, he published a book titled Waging Peace, A Businessman Looks at U.S. Foreign Policy. And that same year, 1956, he founded the Stanley Foundation, along with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 children, with a vision to create a secure peace with freedom and justice, words that are still part of our vision statement today. The foundation started with modest programming. The first big event was held in 1960, and it was called our Strategy for Peace Conference. This became an annual event, and we held the 57th Strategy for Peace Conference this past October. In 1965, Max convened the first UN Issues Conference, marking the 20th anniversary of the UN, and that conference was an attempt to give concentrated attention to real problems facing the UN. And less than 4 weeks ago, we once again convened our annual UN Issues Conference. In 1979, Max published a book titled Managing Global Problems. Max was an engineer and a deep thinker. He was not naive about the problems facing the world and facing the United Nations. So before we move on to talk about some of the new challenges facing the international order, I think it's probably good to talk about some of the old problems. It's very easy to think that all of the things we see in the headlines today, these relatively new problems, are the things that are threatening the order. But the order has actually been under threat almost since the beginning. I'll start off with what I like to call the original sin of the UN Charter. We talk about the U.S. Constitution having an original sin where it defined some human beings as less than human, and we're still paying the price for that today. In the UN Charter, they called out 5 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the Soviet Union, and made them permanent members of the Security Council and gave them permanent veto power over any issue that came before the Security Council. Now, that part of the charter was necessary to get the charter passed. I mean, it wasn't going to happen otherwise, and we could go back and argue about whether or not that's the same case with the U.S. Constitution. But in the UN Charter, that was necessary to get it passed, and it was an issue from day one. It was an issue for over the last 70 years, and it continues to be an issue today. It hinders the UN from addressing many issues. We know today even that the fact that there has not been unified action by the international community on Syria is because Russia has used its veto power in the Security Council to block that from happening. I always am a little chagrined when I see headlines that say UN fails to act on Syria. That's not the case. It's not the UN has failed to act. It's that the Security Council took a vote and the Russians used their veto to stop the UN from acting. From the very beginning, this was a problem, but it became an increasingly large problem as time went on. Those 5 nations are not they do not line up with the 5 most powerful countries in the world today, nor do they line up with the 5 biggest donors to the UN today. Yet they still hold on to that position. That in fact impacts the credibility and legitimacy of anything that the Security Council does. And it is almost impossible to change because they hold that veto. So I've been involved in countless mind-numbing conversations about what can be done to reform the UN Security Council. There are dozens and dozens of great ideas. That's not the problem. The problem is the political will, and any reform effort that you put in front of the Security Council will, by design, dilute the authority of one or all of those P5 members. So one or all of them would veto the measure. So the problem is the political will. It's actually getting them to pass something, but that is a baked-in problem with the United Nations. It's also worth noting that those 5 countries have nuclear weapons, and you know, I mentioned before that there has been this, that the spread of nuclear weapons hasn't gone quite as far as people thought it might, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty also said that those 5 countries, for now, could keep their nuclear weapons, and they all made vague promises that someday they would give them up, but they haven't. And so we've created an unequal system where we have 5 countries with nuclear weapons and a permanent veto in the Security Council, and that is a flaw in the system. Shortly after the creation of the United Nations, we entered the Cold War, and that stymied the institution for years, and the legacy of the Cold War continues to play out in the system. For many years and many decades in the history of that organization, we had the Western Bloc, we had the Soviet Bloc, and then that led to the rise of the non-aligned movement, also called the G77. And those 3 blocs actually still exist. Even though their reason for existing may have completely gone away, those are still the predominant voting blocs within the UN system. There's also this sense that the international order is a weapon used by strong states against weak states. And you'll hear that from a lot of weak states, that the order itself is rigged against them. Sovereignty reigns supreme at the UN, both a feature and a bug of the system. In the UN system, the only sure way to have a voice is to be a sovereign state. And yet that set of voices is simply not adequate for solving most of the world's problems. And we'll talk more about that later. The rule of law has weak enforcement mechanisms, and it always has, giving the impression that some should follow the rules when others don't have to. So these are all problems with the system that have existed for a long time. At the Stanley Foundation, we did a lot of programming in the first half of our history on fixing the institutions, on how to reform the United Nations in general, how to reform the Bretton Woods institutions, how to reform the Security Council. The Cold War certainly loomed large over many of our dialogues. At that Strategy for Peace conference that I mentioned that we've done for coming up on 58 years now, we have concurrent roundtable dialogues. So we have 3 or 4 different tables going simultaneously on different topics. And throughout the 70s and the 80s, almost always one of those tables was about US-Soviet relations. So it definitely dominated our work. We devoted considerable time to the issues of nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. Even had an email today from someone in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who remembered a speaker, a former Stanley Foundation staff person who came down there to lead a seminar on non-proliferation and disarmament. The Stanley Foundation worked during this period to push forward some important items on the international agenda, including the Law of the Sea Treaty, the responsibility to protect, food security, and the global energy crisis. And in the last several years, I would say that many of these old problems have certainly persisted. They may have helped bring about some of the new challenges, but they've also been joined by a whole new raft of threats or challenges to the system. And I'm going to ask Vice President Jen Smyser to come up and talk about those. And then we'll have questions.
Good afternoon. How are all of you? Keith has to plug in my computer because if this goes away, you all are going to be really bored. This segue is actually apropos in a different way, which I did not share with Keith in advance, but this allows me to take over at the point in history when I became a student of the international system. I was graduating from high school as the wall was falling and was truly fascinated with the changes that we were seeing in the real world, and that's what led me to become a cyclone. No, I'm kidding. To study political science and international studies at that other state institution over there. So as our title alluded to, the other part of this is new threats. And actually, after we sent that in, Keith and I started talking about it. And we're like, we should have said challenges. So challenges might be a better word for many of these ideas, but these are all things that are challenging the system. They're pushing up against what is the system that Keith described that has existed for 70 years and served us well, but not been perfect. So what are those things? Rising powers. You all, I'm sure, have heard much about rising powers. You could probably name them with me: China, India, Brazil, South Africa. Many will lump in Russia as a resurgent power in that group, and then you get that nifty acronym BRICS. So, the rising powers, really ever since the unilateral moment, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the community of experts looking at the system have been sort of contemplating, considering, really trying to understand how these countries might change the system. And I don't think that story is done yet, but we've certainly seen the ways that they've sought to change the rules of the road or maybe ignored them outright. An example of that is that very grouping of countries, the BRICS, who went outside of the halls of the existing institutions. They created their own summit process. One of the outcomes of that summit process was a new development bank. And if you consider that partially can be seen as a rejection of the World Bank and its policies, that Bretton Woods institution that, Keith referred to, has a bit of irony in it because it's modeled after that very institution that it's rejecting. So at the same time, they're saying, we don't like the system. They're actually using a part of the system to create their own entity. With rising powers, though, they have a huge advantage, which is they are nation states. So they are automatically a part of the system. And that means that they have a seat at the table. Even if many days they might say it feels like the kids' table at Thanksgiving dinner, they definitely have a seat at the table. Another factor here that is challenging the system is other actors beyond nation states that are looking for a seat at the table. And as we face this increasing number of transnational problems, Keith listed a litany of them, there's more and more recognition that other actors do have a role to play. But how do they get a seat at the power table in order to do it is a challenge. Some non-state examples that I'm sure many of you could come up with specifics for private sector actors, multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations that are doing work worldwide. There are a number of non-state groups that really would like to have a role in governance in addressing those global challenges. Sub-state governments are actually making their own play for addressing some of the world's problems. An example of this from our own work is the C40. This is a network of the world's megacities that is committed to addressing climate change. And they are not waiting for the international system and the countries that have a seat at the table to take this on. They recognize that in the very near future, huge portions of the world's population will be all living in cities, and if they don't get out in front of it, they will be dealing with the consequences. One of the things that is definitely catching the headlines these days in terms of challenges to the international system is the rise of populism. I'm not going to get into the why there's a rise of populism, but what we do see with that rise is an increase in the number of people who see the system as elitist, run by technocrats, and those people also hold often a nationalist view of the world, meaning not based in that system and the idea of an international system at all, but rather that their own country should come first. And they actually believe that participation in that international system makes countries weak. We see this with Brexit. We see it with Trump. We see it with Marine Le Pen in France as one of the finalists in the recent elections for a runoff coming up very soon. Another obvious push against the system is globalization or challenge. Definite winners and losers, and this is at all levels. And again, we see this in the headlines, from the nation states who don't feel like they've benefited from the system as much to individuals who feel that the system is not benefiting them every day through work or otherwise, and do not necessarily see globalization as benefiting them. As Keith alluded to, international law is under assault, and this is a combination of things. Countries failing to recognize their obligations. Another one grabbing the headlines is that obligation to house and protect refugees. as conflicts and other situations create displaced persons, people who have no longer can live in their home and need to go somewhere else. Countries not applying with their obligations, and a recent little bubble up of countries who have said, International Criminal Court, we're no longer going to belong. We're considering pulling out. That is another trend as it relates to international law. Even the debates in the last decade over U.S. torture and our choice to do that as a country, despite our being a party to the Geneva Convention. More examples than I have time for. I'm sure you can all think of your own, but definitely challenges to international law. Bringing it home, we have a weakening of the U.S. commitment to the international order. This is a challenge, not to come across at all as exceptionalist, but there has been a leadership role, as Keith said. The system was built by the West, and in particular the U.S. So when we fail to ratify treaties. That UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, still haven't ratified it. Disability Rights Treaty, can't seem to get that done. The Rome Statute, the thing that would make us a part of the International Criminal Court, we haven't done that. The list of treaties and conventions that we've played a part in making happen, but failed to ratify within our own country is long. Otherwise, we make lots of claims of faith in international law and the system, but we often flaunt it in pretty significant ways, Iraq being a primary example. So there's this growing leadership vacuum, and this isn't just about the U.S., but within the whole of the system, it's happening, it's a challenge. With the top country, the U.S. being effectively giving up its leadership role, not any really good historical analogies for this and understanding what it means. A couple of colleagues of ours that work in this field, Professor John Eikenberry at Princeton, he has said that across ancient and modern eras, orders built by great powers have come and gone, but they've usually ended in murder, not suicide. If that's that, he sees that as the moment we are in. Michelle Flournoy, who is the CEO of the Center for New American Security and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration, recently said, perhaps the most serious threat to the international order would be a failure of the United States to lead the order's adaptation to 21st century realities. So that is a moment. So how does the foundation, just to circle back to that thread that Keith and I were working to weave into this story, fit in this? In this environment, we've, over the last decade and more, really changed the way that we operate, the way that we approach that vision that Keith referred to of our founder. While we retain our core belief that, multilateral action, countries working together, approaching these problems as a collaborative and a collective is vital if we're actually going to solve the problems. We do focus a little bit more now on the problems themselves as opposed to the institutions. And happy to answer questions in Q&A on that. Keith shared with you the 3 areas of work, or maybe it was Tice in the introduction, that we are currently working in terms of policy. We've also expanded our reach. We include rising powers, those countries that have voice, legitimate voice in the system, and bring them to the table as we look at those particular issues that we're working in. We've also focused on different layers of governance beyond the international to include regional actors, states, provinces, even those cities that I referred to. And we've also made effort to include in what we do, but also to elevate the voices of other stakeholders like civil society, private sector actors, and others that are really, truly interested and have something to bring to bear in terms of addressing those global problems. So to go back to the system and sort of what does this all mean, there are any number of signs of disarray or hope that you can pick. I'll share one of each. So Scotland is currently considering where its interests are best served, waiting to see what Brexit means, and are legitimately, I think, as a populace, considering whether or not they should stay a part of the United Kingdom and joining or just joining the EU as Brexit plays out. Keith and I both have a soft spot for Kosovo in our hearts, so it's not hard to think of the Kosovo example. And they have fought so very hard to join the system. And while that certainly serves their self-interest, it also does demonstrate that there's value in being a part of the system. And so where will we see more? When will we see more? Those are questions to be answered in terms of the indicators of disarray or hope. So who can fill this leadership vacuum from the U.S. stepping back or possibly stepping out? There's the expected, those rising powers that we talked about. I think the one to watch is China. There are signs that it sees increasing value in the system and the public goods it generates, and stepping into leadership in unique and interesting ways and still unpredictable ways. The other rising powers and where they choose to step into leadership roles, I think, will largely depend on how it aligns with their national interests and also how far that wave of populism might go. What's less clear is the role of a resurgent Russia. It seems as if they might choose to do what serves their interests and leave it at that. A crumbling EU. The question might come down to what they have capacity to do in terms of stepping into that vacuum. While they might not have the capacity, when you get to the question of who would defend the international order, I think the EU is definitely at the top of the list, and in particular Germany. They know best from their own history what a worse system looks like, and they've also benefited greatly from the system that was created from the ashes of World War II. Pacific Rim states, those that might want to keep the power of China in check, Japan, Korea, and others, really also probably see benefit from the system. On my list is publics and how vocal they might get in saying that there is value in the system and encouraging those very members of the system, their nation states, to remain a part of it. I think that is, I had 3 question marks after it because I think it's a question that none of us necessarily knows the answer to, but will publics actually vocalize their desire for the system and for it to be upheld and for countries to play a proactive and productive part of it. So if we think about the existing order, even if it's just fraying, but if we go to the far end of the extreme and it disappears, what would supplement it? I would actually argue it's already being supplemented in many ways. Other actors, civil society, in particular, has stepped into much of the void and found ways to broaden what governance looks like. There's often good partnership between existing international governmental organizations and civil society. If you look back to the People's March on Climate in 2014, I think you'll see one of those moments. I'm happy to tell you more, but I also know we're getting short on time. Sub-state or regional actors, we brought, I should say, actually Keith brought them, the Courier magazine, which is a publication of the Stanley Foundation, and this cover story on Gambia. The Gambia is an example of a regional governance organization playing a key role in holding peace in terms of the economic community of Western African states. So if you're curious about that, it's there for you. And cities, which are more networked than ever and really ready to tackle the problems and are working to sort of anticipate what those problems are and to avoid them because they understand that that is going to fall on their governments and their ability to do governance well, and so they're preparing for it. And otherwise, within the larger international system, we're already seeing a patchwork of small bore mechanisms, institutions, collaboratives. You can come up with all kinds of labels for them, but these have been created as workarounds to the system, and there are many of them. So if the system collapses, the question of what, if anything, replace it is really unclear. The worst case scenario really is nothing, and that will likely be a state of chaos, and I don't think any of us is interested in getting there. So, the question of whether we work with what we've got or throw the baby out with the bathwater gets a little easier to answer in my mind when you think about the option of there being nothing to replace the current system wholesale. So just some final thoughts for all of you, the experts, the folks that we pay attention to and sometimes interact with, really all over the map on how doomed the system might be. And if you're curious, there's actually in the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs Journal, many opinions, and they've done this mapping of where people fall in terms of whether the system's going to fail or not, or if this is the end of the international liberal order as we know it. So you can take a look and see what those opinions are and figure out where you might line up with them. But one expert, and I'll leave you with this quote, a friend of the foundation, Tom Wright, he's a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy, and a fellow in the Center on the U.S. and Europe at Brookings Institution, says this: all the pieces are in place for an unraveling of the liberal international order. Revisionist powers, a nationalist American president, worldwide populism, and a vulnerable global economy. We just don't know if and how a spark will occur. So, with that, we can entertain questions.
And I'm just curious if maybe you could comment. I know you sort of ended on a rather tenuous note, but just maybe your own view about whether or not the idea of multilateralism and global rule of law has real opportunities to be strengthened as there appear to be more and more reasons every day to have it.
All right, well, you said personal opinion, so we both need to answer, right? Mm-hmm. I definitely believe that multilateral action is possible and vital. I feel like there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. One is that we need to go beyond multilateral action. The multilateral action implies nations working together, and as I said before, many of the transnational problems, nations are necessary but not sufficient to solve the problem. You need lots of other actors. The example I always use is the Gates Foundation. They're the biggest funder in world health matters, in global public health issues, and it would be silly to try to organize a meeting or find solutions without having someone from the Gates Foundation at the table. So that's just one example of a non-state actor that is crucial to solving problems. So we need to do multilateral action, but we also need to expand the voices that are at the table, and we need to be focused on specific problems, I think, right now, rather than trying to improve specific institutions.
If this is a personal opinion, I'm pretty sure I can't say anything other than yes, because otherwise he could fire me. Like Keith, I have been a part of many policy discussions where it is clear that, you know, the best hope that we have at thwarting these challenges that we see in the world is with as many interested stakeholders as possible at the table to help address the problem. And we're continue to try to think creatively about that, in even recognizing that there's opportunity to elevate local voices within many of the processes, and to continue to try to tackle the problems in innovative ways. And it's actually, I think, quite amazing when you look at the system and what probably even 10 years ago was a pretty high level of resistance to any actor other than a nation state being a part of governance. And as the very people who make up governments realized that there was not as much capacity as they'd like to do the things that they wanted to do, they started to turn to the outside, and have really gone full 180 to embracing other actors in addressing those challenges. And I have tons of examples, and I know Keith does too. So,
okay. Good, thank you. So just thinking about the United States for just a little bit, and particularly Keith's comments about how how the erosion of United States support for the United Nations and other and this framework for international governance has been sort of long happening. Do you feel that the America First sort of outlook or President Trump's role is even, I mean, if we were to, as this questioner says, impeach President Trump, would it even make a difference? Or if we were to sort of reset the America First kind of, I don't know, tagline for the United States, does it help, or is it already sort of, are we on the slippery slope already?
Sure. So I think really part of the reason we structured, our talk the way we did, so that we talked about the old problems first, was really to sort of head off some of that. I mean, the fact that there is rising populism, nationalism in the world is, I think, a symptom, not a cause of current problems. In many ways, if you look at what the Trump administration is doing at the UN, it is almost identical to what we've seen previous Republican administrations do at the UN, and that is view it as in sort of a utilitarian way. It's good for us when it does things we want it to do, and we'll ignore it when it does things we don't want it to do. That there's really been not much change, at least over the last 100 days. So I'm not sure if there would be a big change there. I do feel like and again, just my personal opinion and what we see coming from the White House as far as foreign policy goes beyond the United Nations, it seems erratic and contradictory, and the world doesn't like that. That's scary to everyone when it's like in a household when mom and dad are fighting, the kids are afraid, right? And when the United States acts in an erratic sort of way, the rest of the world is frightened. But I have no idea if I like to think that someone with more experience in government, like Mike Pence, whether I agree with him politically or not, whether he might actually be less erratic and more coherent, maybe perhaps in a way that I don't necessarily agree with, but that might be more calming to the rest of the world, I guess.
Just to take us on a little bit of in a different direction, thinking about populism and nationalism around the world, and sort of all the programs that you both have become acquainted with over the years in the international policy under that umbrella. Can you talk about how art, specifically literature and theater, might play important roles in helping reach this rising populism movement, to sort of talk about the benefits of multilateralism and getting along with your fellow human being?
I'm probably the last person to answer this question. Maybe Beth can help me with this one, but Beth is an artist. I imagine that they could have a role, but again, I don't think I'm the person to answer it because I'm not an artist, but there certainly is a role for publics and whatever channels they choose to use to, express their voice. And if art is one of those channels, then absolutely they should. And when I think of the question that Tice was asking, I think of the ways in which we all consume information at this point and then, sort of push back on it. And we spend probably too much time, consuming different forms of media. And that is certainly a platform through which voices are being elevated most right now. So, again, because I just am not an expert on what theater and literature can do, I can't say how that might balance things out. But I think that, for those that are looking for voice, any channel should be used in order to be able to, bring forth their point of view and their preferences in terms of how they want to be governed. So.
I mean, I would just say that I think that at moments like this in history, art has been hugely important, that we've seen some of the greatest works ever created in moments of most uncertainty and chaos, and I think it's hugely important. And not only art, but I think we've also seen how important satire is also in moments like this. And so I think all kinds of forms of expression are useful to publics, and I also think they're useful to individuals as well. So, you know, anytime you are faced with stressful situations personally or in the international system, I think having some sort of artistic some sort of artistic outlet can be a great form of therapy. And you know, maybe we should get all of our world leaders together to you know, take a painting class or a dance class or something together.
I'll be your painting partner.
All right.
So even though there are several still really good questions to ask, I find that the time is getting close to the end, so I'm just going to ask one more question from one of our questioners. And I think that Keith, your discussion about the Security Council veto power sparked a lot of thought. And because you've been a part of so many discussions about how that might be changed, even though it sounds like a little bit of an intractable situation, I still thought maybe you could answer for the questioner some of the ideas about where a solution might be able to be found there. If it were to happen.
Yeah, that one's all yours.
Okay, so I mean, first of all, it's important to remember that we have found ways to work around the Security Council for better or for worse. I mean, Jen mentioned Kosovo. I mean, this is a case where the Security Council actually did not take action, but NATO decided to take action anyway. And later on, the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, called it unlawful but legitimate action that was taken. So I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think there was a certain morality to what happened and what was done, and it was necessary to work around the Security Council. We've failed to do this really in Syria, and then I think most people would point to the U.S. invasion of Iraq as an example of where the Security Council didn't take action, and there was both sort of unlawful and illegitimate action taken by the U.S. and allies in that case. So there are ways around it. I mean, but it's murky. It's vague. It's unpredictable, and so that's a problem. When it comes to actually reforming the Security Council, and I get a little shudder down my spine anytime I even think about the topic. There are all kinds of things that could happen. You know, there are 15 members. 5 of them are permanent. The other 10 are elected by the other members of the UN General Assembly. There could be, you know, one of the most moderate examples is to create maybe 3 more seats that are not permanent, but that have the veto power, or maybe 3 more seats that are permanent but don't have veto. Well, if you give 3 more countries veto, or you just add 3 seats, the other members will say, well, you're already diluting my authority by adding more, and you're making it more difficult to reach consensus because you've added 3 more countries. Adding more vetoes doesn't seem like the right path. Getting countries to, I think one of the other paths that may be slightly more moderate and perhaps plausible is to get the 5 permanent members to jointly agree on some limits to the veto power. So if the Secretary General goes to the UN and says that there is a legitimate case of genocide or mass atrocities somewhere, there is a push right now to get all 5 permanent members to agree that they won't use their veto. They could still vote no, but they wouldn't use their veto in a case that's been certified as a case of mass atrocities or genocide. So those are some very limited ways of kind of constraining some of the power of the Security Council, but it's really hard, and no one is really even holding out hope that the P5 will agree to even those more, you know, very moderate kind of limits.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. I think we've reached the end of our question period, and so I would just like to say thanks again to our speakers today, Keith Porter and Jen Smyser from the Stanley Foundation, for their presentation. Also to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. For those three organizations, very important support for the ICFRC, and our special financial sponsors, John Mininger and Adam and Bridget Ingersoll, and as always to City Channel 4 for all the work they do for the ICFRC and for the community in bringing forums like these to the public. Keith and Jen, I think you've got quite a collection going, but it's still my honor to present, as a token of our appreciation, this very small gift.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. They have enough that they can have one for coffee, one for tea, and one for another beverage of their choice. So thanks to all of you, as always, for attending these programs in person, which we think is even more fun than watching them on videocast.